The night air over the city was sharp and cold, smelling of rain and exhaust. It clung to the dark wool of Alistair Corcoran's overcoat. He stood on the pavement outside of Usilino, a restaurant so exclusive it had no sign. His driver held the door to the black sedan open. The engine hummed a low, respectful tune. Two of his men, broad shadows in tailored suits, stood sentinel a few feet away. They were part of the scenery of his life. Permanent. Silent. Necessary. Alistair was not a man who enjoyed lingering. Dinner was business. Business was concluded. The night should have ended there, with the quiet click of a car door and a smooth departure into the city's glittering veins. But it did not. From the mouth of a dark alley across the street, a figure emerged. A woman. She moved with a desperate, shuffling gait, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. She was a splash of disarray against the clean, hard lines of Alistair's world. His men, Marco and Leo, tensed instantly. Their hands moved inside their jackets. Alistair gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Wait. The woman stumbled into the street, heedless of the passing traffic. A taxi swerved, its horn blaring a furious complaint. She did not seem to hear it. Her eyes were fixed on him. Only him. There was a terrible, raw panic in her gaze, a plea so profound it crossed the street and struck him like a physical blow. She was young. Too young for that kind of fear. Her coat was thin, her face pale under the jaundiced glow of the streetlights. She reached the curb in front of him, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She took one more step. Then her eyes rolled back in her head. She pitched forward. Marco and Leo moved to intercept her, to create a barrier between this disruption and their boss. But Alistair was faster. He stepped forward, past his own security, and caught her before she hit the unforgiving concrete. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. Her head lolled against his chest, her cheek pressing into the expensive wool of his coat. For a moment, there was only the sound of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of his car. Then she whispered. A single word, breathed against his heart. A ghost of a sound. Ailey. The world stopped. It simply ceased to turn. The city noise faded to a dull roar. The cold night air no longer touched his skin. Ailey. A name he had not heard in 40 years. A name buried under decades of concrete and steel, under a new identity forged in violence and fear. Alistair Corcoran, the ghost of the East Side, the man who owned shadows and traded in secrets, did not exist in that single, shattering moment. There was only Ailey. A boy of 10, standing in a field of wildflowers. Marco stepped closer, his voice a low rumble of concern. Boss? Is she? Alistair raised a hand, silencing him. He looked down at the woman in his arms. Her face was slack, her breathing dangerously shallow. He felt a profound and alien sensation. A crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. She's alive, he said, his own voice sounding distant. He adjusted his grip, lifting her fully. He turned not towards the waiting sedan, but towards the clinic he owned 3 blocks away. Get Dr. Evans on the phone, he commanded, his voice regaining its familiar iron. Tell him I am coming. Now. Marco stared, his professional composure rattled. The boss did not get involved. The boss did not touch strangers. The boss certainly did not carry a collapsed woman from the street as if she were made of glass. But Alistair was already moving, his long strides eating up the pavement. The woman in his arms was a question mark. A key to a door he had locked and bricked over long ago. And the name she spoke was the proof. Somehow, this stranger, this desperate, pregnant woman, held a piece of his soul. A piece he thought was long dead and buried. Alistair Corcoran was known by many names. The Ghost. The Patriarch. Mr. C. He was a whisper in boardrooms and a roar in the underworld. His name was a currency of fear, traded by men who understood its value. He had built an empire on a foundation of simple, unbreakable rules. Rule 1, a deal is a deal. Rule 2, family is absolute. Rule 3, never, ever get personal. Business was a cold equation of risk and reward. Emotion was a variable that led to ruin. He had seen it happen to lesser men, men who let anger or love or sentiment cloud their judgment. He had profited from their mistakes. His world was one of order, of control. Every man in his organization knew his place. Every territory was clearly defined. Every transgression had a swift and proportional response. He lived in a penthouse that overlooked the city, a sterile cage of glass and chrome. He had no wife, no children. The family he commanded was one of loyalty and blood oaths, not of shared history or affection. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out. And to keep the past in. The past was a different country, a place with a different name. Ailey. That was the name his mother had used. It was the name a little girl with sunshine in her hair had called him, her hand tucked firmly in his. Lily. Her name was a half-forgotten song. They had grown up in the forgotten part of the city, in a tenement building that smelled of damp and desperation. They were children of neglect, finding refuge in each other. He was the fierce protector. She was the gentle heart. They made a promise in a dusty, sunlit patch of weeds they called their secret garden. "I'll always keep you safe, Lily," he had sworn, his voice full of a boy's solemn gravity. "And I'll always be your friend, Ailey," she had replied, sealing the vow with a shared piece of stolen candy. Then the world had intervened. The world in the form of a fire, a social worker, a system that tore them apart. He went one way, into the brutal machinery of the foster system, and then the streets. She went another, to a family in another state he could never find. Ailey died in a juvenile detention center. Alistair Corcoran was born. He had searched for her, in the beginning. He used his burgeoning power, his network of informants. But the trail was cold, lost in a sea of sealed records and bureaucratic indifference. Eventually, he stopped looking. He convinced himself it was for the best. His world was no place for a girl who carried sunshine in her hair. He had buried her memory deep, alongside the boy who had made her a promise he could not keep. Until now. Until a woman he had never seen before collapsed in his arms and spoke that name. The clinic was a clean, white, anonymous space. It existed off the books, a place for men like him to get patched up without official records. Dr. Evans was a man who owed Alistair his life, and he paid that debt with discretion and skill. He worked on the woman with quiet efficiency. Alistair stood in the corner of the room, a statue of black wool, refusing to sit. He watched the monitors, the rhythmic blip of her heartbeat, the rise and fall of her chest. She was dangerously dehydrated. Malnourished. Exhausted to the point of systemic collapse. "The baby?" Alistair asked, his voice low and tight. "The heartbeat is strong, for now," Dr. Evans said, not looking up from his work. "She's tough. Both of them are. But she's been under extreme, prolonged stress. It's a miracle she's carried the child this long." Alistair's jaw clenched. Stress. That was a sterile word for the kind of fear he had seen in her eyes. Marco entered the room quietly, holding a worn leather handbag. "This was all she had, boss." Alistair took it. His large, manicured hands felt clumsy opening the simple clasp. Inside, there was no wallet. No identification. Just a few crumpled tissues, a tube of chapped lip balm, and a small, folded object wrapped in plastic. He carefully unwrapped it. It was a photograph. Faded and creased, its edges soft with time. It showed two children in a field of weeds and wildflowers. A boy with dark, serious eyes and a fiercely protective stance. A girl with a bright, trusting smile, her hand held firmly in the boy's. It was him. And it was Lily. The air left his lungs. The sterile white room tilted on its axis. He had to place a hand against the wall to steady himself. 40 years. 40 years, and here she was, in a photograph carried by a stranger who knew his name. He looked from the picture to the woman on the bed. He saw it now. The shape of her eyes. The curve of her mouth. It was Lily's face, softened and matured. This was not a stranger. This was her daughter. He felt the old, buried promise claw its way to the surface. "I'll always keep you safe, Lily." He had failed. He had failed her, and now her child was here, broken and terrified, collapsing on his doorstep. A cold, clean rage began to build in his chest. It was different from the calculated anger he used as a tool in his business. This was hot. This was personal. "Find out who she is," he said to Marco, his voice a low growl. "I want a name. I want an address. I want to know who put that look in her eyes." Marco nodded, seeing the shift in his boss. This was no longer a disruption. This was a reckoning. "And find out what happened to Lily," Alistair added, his voice barely a whisper. He looked back at the woman on the bed, this ghost of his past. He had failed the mother. He would not fail the daughter. That was a new promise. And Alistair Corcoran always kept his promises. The information came back within hours. Alistair's network was efficient, a web of whispers and data streams that could uncover any secret for a price. For him, there was no price. Only obedience. He sat in his office, the city lights a cold fire outside his window. A single file lay on his polished obsidian desk. Marco stood by the door, silent. Alistair opened it. Her name was Ilara. Ilara Vance. No, the report corrected. Ilara Hayes. She had recently started using her mother's maiden name. His eyes scanned the page, absorbing the bleak narrative of her life. Lily Hayes had passed away 2 years ago. A quiet, unassuming life. She had worked as a librarian. She had married a man who left her. She had raised her daughter alone, in a small apartment on the other side of the city, a world away from Alistair's gilded cage. The report included a copy of her death certificate. Cancer. A quiet, insidious thief. Alistair stared at the date, a knot tightening in his gut. 2 years ago. While he was closing a deal worth 9 figures, Lily was dying. While he was cementing his power, the girl he had sworn to protect was fading away in a hospital room he could have bought 100 times over. The failure was a physical weight, pressing down on him. He read on. Ilara had been left with nothing but a mountain of medical debt and a predatory landlord. The landlord's name was Julian Vance. The same name Ilara had tried to shed. The file painted a grim picture of Vance. He was a bottom feeder, a man who preyed on the desperate. He had inherited a portfolio of low-income properties and bled them dry. He had hounded Ilara for the debts her mother left behind. Then the narrative took a darker turn. Vance had taken a personal interest in Ilara. The interest of a predator cornering its prey. There were eviction notices, followed by offers of alternative payment. Alistair's hands clenched into fists. He knew this kind of man. A man with no honor, no code. A parasite. The report confirmed the inevitable. Julian Vance was the father of Ilara's unborn child. He had promised her help, a reprieve from the debt. Once she was pregnant, he had abandoned her. Worse, he had demanded she terminate the pregnancy. When she refused, he had threatened her. He had served her with an eviction notice for the day before. She had been on the street, with nothing, headed for a shelter on the east side. Alistair's territory. She had not been coming for him. Not really. She had been running towards a last, desperate hope, and had collapsed at the feet of a ghost from her mother's past. The photograph. The name. Lily must have told her stories. Stories of a boy named Ailey, a fierce protector from a life long ago. A fairy tale. A myth her daughter had clung to in her darkest hour. Alistair closed the file. The silence in the room was heavy, absolute. The internal conflict was over. There was no conflict. His rules were forged for his world, the world of business and power. This was not that world. This was the world of a dusty field of wildflowers. This was the world of a promise made by a boy with nothing to his name but his word. His personal code had been violated, but not by this intrusion. It had been violated by Julian Vance. Men like Alistair had their own ecology. There were predators and there was prey. But you did not harm the innocent. You did not abandon your own blood. You did not prey on the helpless. Those were the unspoken laws, the lines that separated men like him from simple monsters. Julian Vance had crossed every one of those lines. Alistair looked at Marco. Where is he? Marco, who had read the file himself, knew what that question meant. Penthouse apartment. The Aegis Tower. Has 2 private security guards in the lobby, another 2 on his floor. Alistair stood up. The cold, calculated businessman was gone. In his place was something older. Something far more dangerous. Just you and me, Marco, he said. And Leo. Tell him to bring the car around. We're going to have a conversation with Mr. Vance. Marco's expression was grim, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He had served Alistair for 15 years. He had seen him angry. He had seen him ruthless. He had never seen him like this. This was not about territory or money. This was about a debt. Alistair walked to the window and looked down at the city. It was his city. His kingdom. And a parasite had been allowed to fester within it for too long. Tell Dr. Evans that our guest is not to be disturbed, Alistair said. He's back to the room. She is to have everything she needs. When she wakes up, tell her a friend of her mother's is taking care of things. A friend of her mother's. The words felt inadequate, but they were the closest he could get to the truth. He was the ghost of a promise. And tonight, he was going to collect a debt. The plan was simple. Brutally simple. There would be no guns. No overt violence that could be traced. Alistair's power was not in the noise he could make, but in the silence he could command. The Aegis Tower was a monument to new money, a spire of glass and arrogance. The lobby was all marble and pretension. The 2 security guards at the desk were large but soft. They saw Alistair, flanked by Marco and Leo, and they saw wealth. They saw power they recognized but could not place. They did not see a threat until it was too late. Marco approached the desk. We have an appointment with Mr. Vance. The first guard checked his list. I don't have anything scheduled. Leo moved to his side, a silent, imposing presence. Alistair simply watched. Check again, Marco said, his voice calm, but with an edge that brooked no argument. The guard looked from Marco to Leo, then to the immaculately dressed man standing behind them. He saw the stillness in Alistair's eyes. The absolute lack of fear. It was a look he had seen only in documentaries about apex predators. Sweat beaded on the guard's forehead. Let me just call up, he stammered. That won't be necessary, Alistair said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, but it filled the cavernous lobby. It held the weight of unspoken consequence. The guard froze, his hand hovering over the phone. Marco leaned in. We're going up, he said, not as a request. You can either open the elevator for us, or we can open it ourselves. One of those options allows you to keep your job. And your teeth. The choice was not a choice at all. The guard swiped a keycard. A quiet chime announced the elevator's arrival. The ride to the penthouse was silent. The 3 men stood without speaking, the air thick with purpose. Alistair smoothed the lapel of his coat. He was not angry anymore. The hot rage had cooled, solidified into something harder. Colder. A diamond edge of resolve. The elevator doors opened onto a private foyer. 2 more guards, these ones armed and more alert, stepped forward. Who the hell are you? The first one demanded, his hand on his sidearm. Before he could draw it, Leo was on him. It was not a fight. It was a disassembly. A swift, brutal, and silent series of movements. A hand clamped over the man's mouth, another striking a nerve cluster in his neck. The man went limp without a sound. Marco dealt with the second guard with equal, terrifying efficiency. The entire exchange took less than 5 seconds. 2 bodies slumped to the floor, unconscious but alive. Alistair had not moved. He stepped over them as if they were discarded coats. The doors to the penthouse were heavy oak. Marco pushed them open. The apartment was obscene. Gaudy art, ostentatious furniture, a wall of glass showing the city lights. Julian Vance stood by the window, a drink in his hand. He was a man in his late 40s, with a soft, cruel mouth and the entitled air of someone who had never been told no. He turned, a sneer on his face. "Whoever you are, you have 10 seconds to explain why my security." He stopped. He saw Alistair. He did not know the name, but he recognized the archetype. The kind of man who did not make appointments. The kind of man his hired muscle was supposed to keep away. "I don't know who you are," Vance said, trying to project confidence, "but you've made a serious mistake." Alistair walked slowly into the room. Marco and Leo closed the doors behind him, sealing them in. "No," Alistair said, his voice calm. "You made the mistake. A long time ago." Vance's eyes narrowed. "Is this about money?" "Whatever it is, I can pay." "Name your price." Alistair stopped a few feet from him. "This isn't about money," he said. "This is about a girl named Ilara." A flicker of recognition, then annoyance, crossed Vance's face. "The girl? You're here because of her?" "I evicted her. She was behind on her rent." "It's business." "It stopped being business when you put your hands on her," Alistair said. "She was sentimental," Vance scoffed, taking a sip of his drink. "Refuse to be practical." "That's not my problem." Alistair took another step. "It is now." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You don't seem to understand the situation," Alistair continued, his voice a quiet lecture. "In my world, there are rules. We do not harm women. We do not harm children. And we do not abandon our own blood." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your world? What are you, some kind of gangster? You think your rules apply to me?" "They do tonight," Alistair said. "Because you broke another rule. You hurt the daughter of a friend of mine." He reached into his coat and pulled out the faded photograph. He did not show it to Vance. He just held it. "Her mother's name was Lily," he said. "A long time ago, I made her a promise. I promised I would keep her safe." He looked Vance directly in the eye. "I failed. But a promise like that, it doesn't just expire. It carries over. It accrues interest." Vance's smug expression finally began to crumble. He was seeing now that this was not a shakedown. This was something else entirely. Something primal. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "You preyed on a grieving daughter," Alistair stated, each word a hammer blow. "You used her desperation. You put a child in her belly and then you threw her out onto the street like garbage." He took the final step, standing directly in front of Vance. The height difference was not significant, but Alistair's presence seemed to suck all the air out of the room. "Men like you," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "give predators a bad name. You have no honor. You are a sickness." Vance finally broke. Fear, pure and undiluted, flooded his eyes. "Please," he begged, the drink slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers and shattering on the floor. "Take anything. Money. Property. Anything." Alistair looked down at the broken glass. Then he looked back at Vance. "You don't have anything I want," he said. "But you have something Ilara is owed. A clean slate. A future for her child. He turned to Marco. Our lawyers will handle the transfer of his assets. Every property. Every stock. Every dollar. It will be placed in a trust for Elara Hayes and her child. Marco nodded. It will be done, boss. Vance stared in disbelief, then in horror. You can't. That's everything. It's the price, Alistair said simply. Now, for the matter of your continued existence. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous secret. You will disappear. You will leave this city tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back. You will never contact Elara again. You will never contact her child. You will cease to be Julian Vance. If I ever hear your name again, in any context, I will assume you have broken our agreement. He paused, letting the weight of the unspoken threat settle. And my agreements are permanent. Vance was trembling, his face ashen. He understood. He understood that this was not a negotiation. It was a verdict. Alistair stepped back, his part in the conversation finished. He looked around the gaudy apartment one last time. All of this, built on the misery of people like Lily and Elara. Close this account, Marco, he said, turning and walking towards the door. It was his language for a permanent resolution. Marco and Leo would ensure that Julian Vance would not be bothering anyone ever again. Alistair did not look back. As he stepped into the foyer, he slipped the old photograph back into his coat pocket. The debt was paid. The promise was on its way to being kept. Elara woke slowly. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. A deep, peaceful silence she had not experienced in years. The second was the softness. A comfortable bed, clean sheets, a gentle weight of a warm blanket. She opened her eyes. The room was bathed in soft, indirect light. It was not a hospital. It was a bedroom, elegantly and simply furnished. Panic, her constant companion, tried to surface. Where was she? What had happened? She remembered the street. The desperation. The face of a man she had only seen in a faded photograph. And then, darkness. She sat up, her hand instinctively going to her belly. She felt a gentle flutter from within. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. The door opened quietly. Alistair Corcoran stepped inside. He was not wearing the imposing black coat from the night before. He wore a simple dark sweater and trousers. He held a glass of water. He did not look like a gangster from a movie. He looked like a man carrying a great weight. He stopped a few feet from the bed, giving her space. "How are you feeling?" he asked. His voice was softer than she remembered, stripped of the command it had held on the street. I'm okay," she whispered, her throat dry. "My baby." "The doctor says you are both healthy," he replied. "You just needed rest. And safety." He placed the glass of water on the bedside table. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. The face from the photograph was there, hidden beneath the hard lines of age and experience. The serious eyes were the same. "You're him," she said, her voice full of wonder. "You're Ailey." Alistair's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. A sadness. A memory. "I was," he said. "A long time ago." "My mother, she told me stories," Elara said, tears welling in her eyes. "She always said if I was ever in real trouble, I should look for the boy from the picture. She said you were her protector. I thought it was just a story." "It wasn't," Alistair said. "It was a promise." He pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, a gesture that was both commanding and strangely gentle. "Your mother was my dearest friend," he said. "We were separated. I looked for her. For years. I never found her." The guilt was plain in his voice, an old, raw wound. "I should have been there for her," he said, more to himself than to her. "I should have protected her. It wasn't your fault," Ilara said softly, repeating words her mother had likely said to herself 1,000 times. She had a good life. It was quiet. But she was happy. She missed you. Alistair simply nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The man, Ilara began, her voice trembling slightly. Julian Vance. You will not have to worry about Mr. Vance ever again, Alistair said, his voice regaining a sliver of its iron edge. The problems he caused you are over. All of them. The finality in his tone was absolute. Ilara did not need to ask what it meant. She could feel the safety of it, a shield erected around her and her child. What are you? She asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. It was not accusatory. It was born of pure, honest confusion. Are you a good man? Alistair looked at his hands, then back at her. The question hung in the air between them. A good man? He thought of the things he had done. The violence. The fear he commanded. The empire built on a foundation of broken laws. He was not a good man. He knew that. But then he looked at her, at Lily's daughter, safe and warm in his care. For your mother, I was supposed to be, he said, his voice low and heavy with meaning. And for you? I will be whatever you need me to be. The answer was not a denial or a confession. It was a new promise. A vow. She tried to thank him, to find words for the gratitude that was overwhelming her. I have nothing, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I can't possibly repay you. You don't have to, he said, standing up. Your mother gave me a gift a long time ago. A memory of a time when things were simpler. Keeping you safe, that settles the account. He walked to the door. This house is yours now, he said. It's in a quiet neighborhood. It is secure. There is a trust fund set up for you and your child. You will never have to worry about money again. It was a new life, delivered as simply as a weather report. He placed a small, simple card on the dresser. It had only a phone number on it. This is my private number, he said. If you ever need anything, at any time, you call. You will never be alone again, Ilara. He said her name as if it were precious. He had given her back her future. He had given her back her name, free of the man who had tainted it. Before he could leave, she said his name. Ailey. He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, his back to her. Thank you, she whispered. He did not turn around. He only gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he was gone, leaving behind a profound and unbreakable silence. The silence of safety. The silence of a promise finally kept. 5 years later. The sun was warm on the back of Ilara's neck. She sat on a bench in a lush, green garden, watching her son play. He was a whirlwind of energy and laughter, chasing a bright red ball across the perfectly manicured lawn. He had her eyes, but a serious, determined set to his small jaw that was not hers. His name was Alistair. But she called him Ailey. Her life was a quiet symphony of peace. The house was a home. The fear was a distant, half-forgotten nightmare. She had everything she needed. More than she had ever dreamed of. Once a month, a black sedan would pull up to the curb. Alistair Corcoran would get out. He never stayed long. He would watch her son play, a quiet, unreadable expression on his face. He would ask if she needed anything. She never did. But she knew the question was a ritual. A renewal of his vow. Her son adored him. He called him Mr. C. To the boy, he was just a quiet, serious man who sometimes brought him intricately carved wooden toys and always watched him with a strange, sad kindness in his eyes. He was family. A strange, unspoken, fiercely protective kind of family. Miles away, in a sterile office high above the city, Alistair Corcoran signed a document that would shift the balance of power in the city's shipping industry. His desk was a landscape of ruthless efficiency. Ledgers, contracts, reports. But on the wall behind him, amidst the stark, modern art, was a single, small frame. It did not hold a priceless painting. It held a piece of construction paper. On it was a child's drawing, rendered in thick, colorful crayon. It depicted a very tall stick figure with dark hair holding hands with a much smaller stick figure. Underneath, in wobbly, backward letters, was written, Mr. C. and Ailey. It was the only personal item in the entire room. A memento. A reminder. Not of the man he was, but of the man he was allowed to be, for a few precious hours each month. A man's life is often defined by the choices he makes in the darkness, by the rules he is willing to break for power or for profit. But sometimes, if he is very lucky, his life can be redefined by a single choice made in the light. A choice to honor a promise buried by time, to answer a call for help that the world has ignored. True strength is not found in the ability to command fear, but in the quiet resolve to protect the vulnerable. And redemption is not always a grand, sweeping gesture, but can be as simple and as profound as a child's drawing, a whispered name, and a promise, finally, blessedly kept.